Somerset Rivers Authority said it in plain language during an operational briefing. We cannot currently run any pumps upstream of Boroughbridge because the river cannot hold any more water. Pumps can only operate when there is capacity in the river to receive the floodwater. That is not a policy failure, that is a physics wall. As we covered, Storm Chandra triggered a major incident across Somerset in late January 2026, flooding more than 300 properties, while 16,200 held behind defences running at capacity. In Wales, families became the UK's first official climate evacuees. That was the human cost. This video is about the machinery underneath, because this was not one flood with one cause. It was a system hitting its physical limits at every level at the same time. The sky would not stop delivering. The ground could not absorb. The rivers could not carry, and the pumps could not discharge. Meanwhile, the tide would not let the water leave. To understand why no engineer could fix this, you need to understand three things: a blocked jet stream, a saturated sponge, and a tide that fights you. Here is how they connected. In a normal winter flood, the sequence is simple and it works. A storm drops heavy rain, rivers rise, and water spreads onto floodplains, which is exactly what floodplains exist to do. Pumps activate, defenses hold, and eventually the rain stops. Rivers drop, water drains through gravity and tide gates, and the system resets. The UK has managed this cycle for centuries, building its entire infrastructure around it. Pumps, gates, channels, raised banks, all designed for a system where the water comes, the water rises, and then the water leaves. This event broke that cycle at 3 points simultaneously. First, the rain did not stop. The Met Office identified a south-shifted jet stream combined with a blocking high-pressure system over Scandinavia. In plain terms, the atmospheric river of air that normally steers storms across the UK and moves them east had hit a wall. Storms arrived and could not pass through. Instead, they stalled, dumped their moisture, and recycled, while the next system was already queuing behind them. A blocked conveyor belt pointed at Britain with the off switch jammed. Second, the ground stopped absorbing. By the time Storm Chandra arrived on January 26th, the catchment had already received 165% of its average January rainfall. The soil was saturated, with every pore between every particle already occupied by water and infiltration capacity reduced to zero. Rain hit the surface and ran sideways into the drainage network at speeds the system was never designed to handle. Third, the drainage system hit capacity and refused to budge. Rivers overflowed, pumps locked out, and tide gates were blocked by spring tides pushing back from the coast. Every exit sealed at the same time. A normal flood is a spike. It peaks, it recedes, and you clean up. What hit the UK in January and February 2026 was a plateau. The water arrived and had nowhere to leave, so every new storm added volume to a system already at maximum. The engineering was not inadequate. It was running exactly as designed. However, the conditions exceeded every parameter it was designed for, simultaneously. Let me walk you through the mechanism step by step, because each stage feeds the next and the order matters. Start with the sky. The jet stream is the river of fast-moving air at high altitude that steers weather systems across the Atlantic and into the UK. Normally, it carries storms in and pushes them east, so they pass through, drop rain, and move on. However, the Met Office identified something specific in January and February 2026. The jet stream shifted south while a blocking high-pressure system parked itself over Scandinavia. That block acted like a concrete barrier, meaning Atlantic lows slammed into the UK and could not progress east. Instead, they stalled, dumped their moisture, and weakened without leaving, while the next low-pressure system was already arriving behind them. The Met Office described it as a conveyor belt of low-pressure systems. Translation: the atmosphere pointed a fire hose at Britain, and the steering mechanism that normally redirects it jammed in position. Now follow the moisture. Each of those stalled systems carried serious water. The Met Office's Storm Chandra analysis describes a deepening Atlantic low drawing a vigorous fetch of moist air from the southwest. Essentially, a sustained moisture pipeline pulling warm, water-heavy air straight off the ocean. When that air hits the hills and mountains of southwest England and Wales, it is forced upward, cools rapidly, and rings out. Chandra alone dropped 50 millimeters widely and up to 100 millimeters on high ground in roughly 24 hours. And Chandra was just one storm in a sequence that had been running for weeks. Now look down. Oh, the Somerset Rivers Authority published a number that tells you everything. By January 25th, the day before Storm Chandra arrived, the catchment had already received 165% of its long-term average January rainfall. The ground was not just wet. It was saturated with every soil pore occupied and infiltration capacity at zero. When Chandra's rain hit that surface, it had nowhere to go but sideways, running straight off into streams, into rivers, and into the drainage network at a rate the system cannot handle. Think of a sponge sitting in a puddle. Everything you pour on top goes sideways. That was Somerset on January 26th. The runoff hits rivers that are already high from weeks of previous rain, pushing them even further. And here the critical failure locks in. The Somerset levels are flat, so drainage depends entirely on three things: river capacity, pump stations, and tide gates. When the rivers fill to the top, pumps cannot operate because there is nowhere to pump the water to. Somerset Rivers Authority stated it plainly. Pumps can only operate when there is capacity in the river to receive the floodwater. No capacity means no pumping, which means the water sits. And then the sea closes the last exit. Somerset Council confirmed in their own flood updates that spring tides slow drainage and affect pumping operations, with the tide pushing back against river outflow at the coast and creating hydraulic back pressure. The river cannot empty because the ocean is pushing the other way. Later updates noted the shift toward neap tides reduced this tidal impact and helped drainage, but during the critical window, the tides were working against every other system. So trace the chain. A blocked jet stream fires storms into the UK. A moisture conveyor loads them with water. Saturated ground rejects every drop. Full rivers cannot carry the runoff. Pumps lock out because the rivers have no room. And spring tides block the coastal exit. 5 failures, all active, all simultaneous. The system did not fail at one point. It hit its physical limits everywhere at the same time. Now look at the ground itself, because Somerset and Dorset are dealing with 2 completely different floods caused by 2 completely different mechanisms. Same week, same weather, but entirely different physics. The Somerset levels are not normal terrain. They are reclaimed marshland, low-lying, flat, and naturally at or below the water table. Without pumps, without tide gates, without maintained river channels, this land would be permanently underwater. It was wetland before humans drained it, which means every dry day on the levels is an engineering achievement, and every flood is the land reverting to what it actually is. The key infrastructure sits at Dunball, a tide gate and pumping station. The Environment Agency gives us a hard number: 10 cubic meters per second removed, with planned capacity up to 15 cubic meters per second. Write that down: 10 to 15 cubic meters per second. That is the entire drainage capacity of the main exit point for a basin covering hundreds of square kilometers. Now calculate what 50 to 100 millimeters of rainfall across that catchment produces in runoff. The pumps are a garden hose trying to drain a swimming pool with the tap still running. At Boroughbridge, all the River Parrett becomes the choke point. Upstream pumps cannot run because the Parrett is already full, while downstream the tide gate opens only when tidal conditions allow gravity drainage. The entire system depends on a sequence: pump into river, river carries to coast, tide gate opens at low tide, water exits to sea. Break one link and the chain fails. Every link broke. Now shift to Dorset, because this is a different animal entirely. Dorset's flooding comes from groundwater emergence, water rising through the ground from below. Dorset Council confirmed that groundwater levels hit historic highs, with some gauge boards peaking above their measurement scale. The EA's Dole's Ash borehole recorded a level of 123.165 meters, and it was still rising. You cannot sandbag against groundwater, and you cannot pump an aquifer in any meaningful time frame. You cannot divert water that is moving through geological formations beneath your foundation. Surface flooding you can see and fight, but groundwater flooding arrives through the rock under your house. The only solution is time. Months of dry weather allowing the water table to drop naturally. That is not engineering. That is hoping the weather cooperates, and the weather is not cooperating. Now let me put numbers on everything, because numbers are where opinions end and physics begins. Start with the rainfall loading. Somerset received 165% of its average January rainfall before Storm Chandra even arrived. That is not a wet month, but a month and 2/3 of water already in the ground before the main event. Then Chandra dropped 50 to 100 millimeters in 24 hours on top of that, followed by another system, and then another. The catchment was not filling, it was already overflowing before the headline storm hit. On the evening of Sunday, February 8th, the Environment Agency had 96 flood warnings active across England with 219 flood alerts stacked on top, bringing the total to 315 notices that flooding was either occurring right now or would begin within hours. That is the national warning system running near saturation, a system designed to be an early alert that had become a permanent status board. Now the property numbers. 300 confirmed flooded, but 16,200 protected by flood defenses. That ratio matters, and it cuts both ways. The defenses work for 98% of properties in their coverage zone, which is genuinely a success. However, all 16,200 protected means 16,200 homes that exist only because a pump kept running, or a wall held, or a gate opened at exactly the right tidal window. Pull any one of those out, and the 300 becomes thousands. The margin between protected and destroyed is mechanical, and that mechanical margin was running at maximum for weeks without rest. Across the Southwest, 145 roads closed and rail services were suspended. Emergency road closure gates activated at the A361 between Eastling and Boroughbridge. Cutts Road was sealed. Langport to Mochelney became impassable, and New Road at West Ling went underwater. Each closure does not just block traffic. It cuts a community off from hospitals, schools, and supply chains. Islands forming in England, now Dorset. 18,000 properties across the Bristol, Somerset, Dorset, and Wiltshire operational area sitting in the groundwater flood risk zone, with gauge boards reading above their measurement scale and the EA's Dole's Ash borehole at 123.165 meters and expected to rise further. When your monitoring instruments cannot display the current reading because they were never calibrated for conditions this extreme, you are operating blind. The data has exceeded the tools designed to measure it. And here is the comparison that tells you where this sits historically. The last major Somerset levels flood was 2013 to 2014, when moorland went underwater for weeks and it became a national crisis. The government responded, dredging 8 kilometers of the Parrot and Tone, building the Dunball infrastructure, and upgrading pumps. Those investments worked, but only for the conditions they were designed for. In 2026, the same village flooded again despite better infrastructure because the weather had outpaced the engineering. They spent the money, they built the pumps, they dredged the rivers. It was not enough. Not because the work was poor, but because the climate envelope moved and the infrastructure did not move with it. Here is where every proposed fix runs into the same wall. More pumps. That is the first thing people say. Build bigger pumps, install more of them, run them harder. However, the Somerset Rivers Authority already explained why that fails. Pumps can only operate when there is capacity in the river to receive the floodwater. The Parrot is full and the Tone is full. You could bolt the most powerful pump in Europe to the bank at Boroughbridge and it would sit idle because the water it removes has nowhere to go. The bottleneck is not pump capacity but river capacity. And river capacity is fixed by channel dimensions, gradient, and tidal conditions, none of which change during a crisis, and none of which change cheaply or quickly even outside one. Dredging. After 2014, the public demanded it. Dredge the rivers, make them deeper, carry more water, and dredging was done across 8 kilometers of the Parrot and Tone, which helped. However, dredging moves the bottleneck rather than removing it. A deeper channel carries water to the coast faster, but the coast has a tide gate that only opens at low tide. If the tide is high, the water backs up at the exit of your nice new deeper channel and sits there. You accelerated the queue, but the exit door is the same width. Flood defenses. The 16,200 properties protected number sounds like a victory, and it is one. However, defenses are designed to a standard of protection, typically a 1 in 100 year event. When the actual event exceeds that standard, the defense does not bend. It either overtops or it holds, while the water finds the nearest undefended section and floods that instead. Defenses protect individual locations, but they do not reduce the total volume of water in the system. That water must go somewhere. Groundwater. In Dorset, the engineering impossibility is absolute. You cannot pump an aquifer dry in any meaningful time frame because an aquifer is a geological formation, rock extending for kilometers in every direction beneath the surface. The water table will drop only when rainfall stops long enough for natural drainage to work, which takes months and sometimes longer. You cannot sandbag your foundation against water rising through the bedrock your house is built on. There is no engineering solution, only waiting. And that brings us to the real admission. Jonathan Day, flood duty manager at the Environment Agency, warned of continued risk and emphasized groundwater impacts across Dorset and Wiltshire. The Met Office attributed the weather pattern to a shifted jet stream and Scandinavian blocking, neither of which is something an engineer can fix with a pump or a wall or a budget. The infrastructure was designed for a certain climate, but the climate delivered something else. The gap between what the system can handle and what the atmosphere is now delivering is widening every winter, and no one in any official briefing has been able to say when or whether that gap will close. Whilst the engineers did their job and the infrastructure does what it was built to do. It was built for a climate that no longer exists. That is the admission nobody wants to make publicly, but the data says it anyway. The physics here is not complicated. A blocked jet stream delivers rain, saturated ground rejects it, full rivers cannot carry it, and locked tides will not release it. Pumps sit idle because there is nowhere to send what they remove. That is not a failure of planning or funding or competence. It is infrastructure built for one climate colliding with weather delivered by another. 16,200 homes protected, 300 flooded. The system held for most, but held means operated at maximum capacity for weeks without relief. That is not resilience. That is a machine running in the red. And the question every hydrologist in the UK is asking is not whether the next storm will be worse, but whether the next storm will arrive before this one's water has drained. The system did not collapse, it maxed out. And a system at maximum has zero margin for next time. Groundwater in Dorset is still rising, with the borehole at Dole's Ash reading 123.165 meters and expected to climb further. Somerset's pumps are still running, and the ground remains saturated. Meanwhile, monitoring data from the weeks following shows something engineers feared. Groundwater levels are not dropping at the rate historic models predicted. The aquifer is holding longer. and the flood zone is expanding into areas that have never flooded before. We will cover the latest projections and what they mean for the 18,000 properties in the risk zone in our next update. The rain stopped, the water did not, and the system that is supposed to drain Britain is still waiting for a river that can take it.